All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Erin Mihal, and I serve as the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement, Leadership Engagement here at Emory University. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping announcements for today's session. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in the Learning Development webinars are those of the individual speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official policy position or views of Emory University, the Emory Alumni Association, or its affiliates. The content provided in this program is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as an endorsement by the Emory University or Emory Alumni Association. This session is being recorded, so please be sure to keep your microphones muted to avoid disruptions. Though we encourage you to keep your camera on, we love seeing your faces. If you have any questions throughout this session, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Mark will be stopping periodically to go over those questions. And I'll be monitoring that chat for you guys. And we will also have time at the end of the presentations to take additional questions. I'm excited to introduce our featured speaker, Mark Myette. Mark is a principal at ECC Inc., Chief Curator of whatareyourgifts.com, an independent business owner, and a certified coach via Facet 5, Gallup StrengthsFinder, Total, SDI, ICF, and the Executive Coaching Diploma from Emory University's Guazetta School of Business. He assists individuals and teams to identify, understand, and leverage their gifts, strengths, and discover how they can maximize their performance and personal commitment. Mark also has his QR code displayed on the screen if you want to see more information about him on his LinkedIn page, so you can connect with him on LinkedIn. Please help me welcome Mark Myette.
Erin, thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. I have noticed that somebody is logged in all the way in the West Coast. So good morning to you. So wherever you're accessing this live session or recording, the fact that you're logged into it tells us perhaps you're at a crossroad, or you're doing research, or you're gathering context, which is why on my cover slide we have the word why. So because how to transition also should be also reflected in this concept of pursuing entrepreneurship, and that's what we'll be talking about during the session. One housekeeping note: if you have any questions, type them in chat. I will be stopping periodically to say if there's anything come through chat, Erin, and then if that's appropriate, we'll address it. If not, I might say, well, stay tuned because we'll be talking about that in a little bit. First things first, though, we'll talk about who's here. I want to get you to gather some information. Erin has a few polls that's going to be tell us who's here. Then I'll get into the level setting of, well, truly, what are things to consider around this concept of pursuing a business or doing your own thing, or even more basic, pursuing this concept of entrepreneurship. And then we will be sharing chock full of resources as well as we go. Erin will be following up also with a number of hyperlinks to data resources I'll be referencing during today's presentation. So stay tuned to that in chat. All right, so let's talk about who is here. So Erin, can you come up with share the first one? So the first chat or poll we have is how to transition. What is your employment career situation? Select the best answer, single choice. The second question is, in your career right now, which best describes you? And then you can select all that apply. And then the third question is, how many years have you been in the workforce? And then you can choose one. So ideally choose one. And then don't worry about that last question, because that one's just press submit at the end, because I think that's just a blank one. All right. So at the bottom of that, just click submit. All right, we're about 75%. This is great. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Excellent. We'll close the poll. Let me just share the results. And some of you who didn't share, you might say, well, Mark, I don't know how to do it. So you're on an iPhone or something else. Type it in chat if that's working. You'll notice that we have kind of the two top ones on what is your employment career situation. Still employed, working on site, about 46%. And then we have about 38%. So not working in transition. So good for you for using this time to reflect on what it might mean to potentially consider going a more independent route, assuming that's why you're here. In your career right now, which best describes you? So those that are going, you'll notice like the top choice, something is not right. And also, which is, by the way, not unusual. And I'll explain in a moment. How many years have you been in the workforce? And you'll start to see we have a majority of folks are between 11 and 20 years. And the fact that you're on this call supports one of my key premises. And then the next tier is the 21 to 30 years. So about 31%, or about almost a third. So the reason why I'm wanting to know where you're at in your career is because this is a normal thing that happens. The reason why I wanted to find out where you are in your career is about the second quarter into the third quarter, or even third into fourth. We hear this song done by this Scottish group years ago, and they came out with an album when they did album and CD called Joshua Tree, and there was a song on their Joshua Tree album that kind of went like this: I still haven't found what I'm looking for. So I would like to say that if you're kind of like something's not right, guess what? That's in full support of I still haven't found what I'm looking for is playing in the back of your head, and it gets louder and louder and louder the further you get in your career. So it's no surprise that I will challenge you when you think about in your third into fourth quarter of your professional journey, you should begin to be thinking more about less occupation, but more vocation, vocari, calling, purpose. And if you can do that, as you might have heard in the past, you'll never work a day in your life. So that said, thank you very much for sharing where you're at. Gives us some good context about who's here. The other thing, which you saw the slide briefly, is that understanding that you are a gift. We're all gifts. We all have certain talents and abilities that we have that we just do naturally. So many times when you're at this fork in the road, we sometimes underestimate our natural talents or our strengths. When you're at this crossroad, which might also include becoming your independent business owner or starting a business, being aware of what those gifts are can be really helpful, especially if you're considering perhaps one of the options, which might be, is to consider getting into a partnership with someone else. So the interaction in this program continues. I wanted you to keep a mental tab. We're going to do a quiz. I'm sorry, Irem, I didn't share that we would be having people do a quiz, but this one's going to be pretty simple. Yes, no, and just keep a mental tab. There's 10 questions, so keep your score. First question, can you stomach risk? It's either a yes or a no. A yes would be a tick. So count that. To achieve significant results, are you willing to spend more money than you planned and wait 3 times as long as you think you'll have to be achieving significant results? Yes or no? Are you willing?
Sorry to interrupt, Mark. If it helps you guys, put your answers in the chat.
Or you can keep a mental tab, Aaron. Just keep because I want them to give me their total score where they landed. So we've got 10 questions. So are you willing to engage in honest work with deep concentration? Is freedom more important to you than power? True or false? You don't rely on praise and security. So a yes would be added to your score. True or false? Anonymity doesn't bother you. So not being known. Working behind the scenes, true or false? Are you passionate about your product or said service? Or you're thinking about a product or a service? Do you analyze before you proceed or just do what seems best? Kind of have an idea, because if we have people that are logged into this webinar, tells me how you might be wired. Number 9, do you accept personal responsibility for failure? And the last one, do you persist so long that your friends, your families sometimes think you're unreasonable? So here we are. Here's where the 10 questions. Now type your quiz results in chat. So in other words, type in chat where your score ended up. 10 being the highest, and then 0 being the lowest. So where you landed on that, if you're keeping track of that, what score would you give yourself? Yay, Maureen. Crystal, also a 9. Lauren, an 8 of 10. Somewhere between 4 and 6, depends on if I'm being honest with myself, and a 6 or a 9. So the thing about assessments, and this is kind of a really informal quote assessment, is that assessments are not usually 100% right, but they're good indicators. So anything above a 7 would indicate you've got you have potentially the right wiring, and we'll talk about this wiring concept in a bit, but you potentially might have the right wiring that if you decide to go down this road of becoming a business owner, independent business owner, then you might have the temperament for it. If you scored less than a 7, that just indicates, you know what? All right, there might be a certain way of doing that without maybe doing a startup. And again, it's an input. Doesn't mean it's 100% accurate, okay? But at least as an input. Iram, I'm going to pause here and see if anyone has a comment or question, and we'll proceed if not. Okay, silence, standing ovation. I'm going to continue, which gets us into, if you don't mind, I'm going to level set this concept of entrepreneurship. Is first and foremost, how do we define entrepreneurship? Because we hear the term bantered about, and we think about Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, the woman who started Spanx, Laura Blakely, Sarah Blakely. So we think of those folks as the entrepreneurs. If you're a fan of the Entourage way back when, they defined entrepreneurship as living a few years of your life like most people won't, so that you can spend the rest of your life like most people can't. The other thing is, at the core though, beyond that, just that the definition from the Entourage, the basic definition of entrepreneurship is someone who owns a business. Basically, at the core, that's really what entrepreneurship is. Someone who owns a business. So if you're on this webinar, you're at this crossroad perhaps, or you're thinking, you know what, I'm thinking about doing something. I just haven't quite put a finger on it, or I'm gathering information. So you are potentially an entrepreneur. So give yourself a round of applause. Now, there are some myths and one really big truth about being an entrepreneur. Myth number 1 is you get to do more of what you love. In some cases, that may not be true. Yeah, another myth is that you get to be your own boss. As you're going to find out, especially those that have been in the business for a while, or your own business for a while, there's some truth to that, maybe not so much, but it is a glamorous thought. The other myth is business is all about you, when the reality of it is no. 4th myth, it's easy. If it's so easy, everybody would do it. So that's a myth. The 5th myth is you can means the same thing as you should. Just because you can do your own thing doesn't mean you necessarily should. And then here's something I referenced on that quiz previously. And this goes back to the really big truth, the rule of 3. Keep this in the back of your mind, especially if you're thinking of pursuing this. Think of the rule of 3. The rule of 3 are, it'll take you 3 times longer than you thought. It's going to be 3 times more expensive than you thought. And it's also going to be 3 times harder than you thought. And let's face it, we're all optimists, or many times business owners are true optimists because they're optimistic about their capability, about their service, about their product. You start just starting a business, an entity that's independent speaks of some degree of optimism. But just be aware that your optimism is great, but it might be maybe not as realistic as you thought. So something to keep in mind. All right. So that's great, Mark. So, but what does the data really say? So here's what the data says. And this data is coming from Gallup. You're going to see I'm leading in a lot on Gallup's research because they did a lot through this, and I'll explain why. One of the things they've identified in their research is 5 in 1,000 people have the aptitude for starting and growing a big business. A big business is defined as a worldwide conglomerate. So 5 people in 1,000 have the aptitude of actually doing that. And guess what? I would love to think that one of these 5 are on this call today, but guess what? Those that are already started this business are not on this call. Hate to break it to you. Maybe, hey, prove me wrong. 20 in 1,000 people have IQs high enough to be accepted into Mensa. So look at that. More people qualify for Mensa than actually have the aptitude of starting a global conglomerate. If you think about it, it's really interesting thing to reflect on. The other is entrepreneurial attributes. So what makes an entrepreneur are usually baked by the time you're 14. So if you're beyond 14 today and you might be in your 3rd quarter, 2nd quarter of your journey, you're wondering, well, I haven't done my own thing. Don't worry, don't fret about that, because in some ways you've probably have enhanced or developed even further in your corporate roles or your roles which might be maybe not business oriented or independent business oriented. You've honed those skills that will come back to serve you well. Entrepreneurs over 40, which supports what I just talked about, have a higher success rate than 20-somethings. So if you're on this call and you fit into this demographic or beyond, then you can expect a higher success rate than if you were in your 20s trying to do the exact same thing. And the average person has 2 entrepreneurial attributes that are dominant. And I'll share what those attributes are in a bit. But the average person has 2. And the average Inc. 500 CEO has 5 attributes that are dominant. In other words, they're weighted beyond the normal scale. So that's part of what the research says. Here's also what the research also says beyond just what I've just shared. And give you a second to read this slide. So you'll start to see that most Americans are willing or want to be their own boss. And you'll start to see, yeah, there's some financial risk, but the preferences are, you'll start to see, whoa, I'm not the only one that has this hankering. But then you'll start to see also when it gets into financial risk and how much people are able to or willing to tolerate, you'll start to see that those who identify a great deal of tolerance are not as prevalent as those that are fair amount and only a little. And even that is like, what's that defined by? Now, since you're a fan of data and where this is coming from, this too came from Gallup. And this was done based on a Spotify survey that was done literally between May 1st and May 14th earlier this year. So this data is fresh. And I'll be referencing a link later on to more of the detail about this report. The other thing, let me just bring up my screen here so it's going to be easier to read. and you'll see the most important reason for starting and wanting to start a business. And you'll start to see that there's a difference between current business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs. The biggest one where both of them landed is you want to be your own boss, an opportunity to earn more money. And then you'll start to see the numbers start to go down relative to these other attributes. More flexible work schedule, pursuing a passion project. And you'll start to see some deltas between the current business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs. So there's a 15-point delta between to pursue a passion project. There's some business owners that are like, not so much. But guess what? I'm starting my business based on more a need that is going to fill in the market, which is more than what aspiring entrepreneurs have. But you'll start to see the other attributes of what the other drivers were. And again, these data points are from this Shopify Gallup study done earlier in May. So that's another piece of data. All right. And and here's something else. And let me just go back. So this is a bit of an eye chart, so I apologize, which is why I'm expanding this. Financially matters, biggest challenges to starting a business for prospective owners. And you'll start to see some of the biggest challenges around the financing is going to be lack of money or concerns about personal financial risk going into the business. And then you'll start to see it starts to peter off. Still about a third is around inflation, and then need to learn more about starting and managing a business. So you start to see this is about the third. And then you'll start to see that it starts to go down further and further based on these other attributes. Again, we'll provide you a link to this report. So that way, if you want to go deep to validate how you're feeling and why, then you'll have that information. Let me just pause here. Let's see. Okay. So before I go, let me pause. Iram, let me see. Did anything come to chat that we might need to address?
No, sir.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So you'll find out that I wrote a book a while ago called Entrepreneur, Do You Have What It Takes to Be an Entrepreneur? So it's, it's a self-published work I did. And as part of that work, I wrote this, I came up with this concept called the E-band, also referred to as the entrepreneurial band. And so what this E-band was I basically said, based on different types of entrepreneurial entities out there, we will fit on different parts of that E-band, entrepreneurial band. One of those bands is a startup. So this is starting something really big. You have this idea and then it goes global. The Sarah Blakeleys, the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gates, and those that do other startups that have gone absolutely global. You'll start to see that these folks have an idea and they just go for it. And remember what we were talking about earlier. The likelihood that we are wired to do startups, we're in the minority just because how we're wired. So that's one band. Another band is a standalone business. And a standalone business is defined as something as simple as it might be filling a need in your community. It might literally be a brick and mortar business. It might be a standalone service business that might be solely on the internet. It might be a virtual business. But it's something that is a single entity. It's a standalone. If it's a brick and mortar, it might be providing a service, a restaurant, a dry clean, a floral shop, a consulting firm. But it's a single entity. So that's the next layer of the E-band. The other layer is what's referred to as, I like to refer to it as a business in a box. This is where you can either invest in, can become an owner of, a business that has already been developed and templated. Some people refer to this potentially as franchising. Some people refer to these as independent business opportunities. So it depends, but I call this a business in a box because you're basically taking the different aspects of a business, making an investment in that, which could be anywhere from $100 to multi-million dollars, depending on what the business is, but it has that scale that literally somebody else has devised the process, the business model, and everything else. And you're basically putting the pieces together and building your business following that. So business in a box is the third level. Another one, which we don't want to necessarily underestimate, is 1099 opportunities, which is basically you are a contractor working with different businesses, providing your expertise. But you're, in some cases, you might be a W-2, but technically you might be actually a contract worker with them, effectively working as a 1099. And it was before the pandemic, it was estimated that a majority of those that have W-2 positions would actually be contractors in their businesses or the business that they're working with. And that got met before the pandemic, and it's only become further and further. So 1099 opportunities, a contractor. And you would know any Uber drivers? And you would know any Lyft drivers? Because guess what? They're 1099. And you would know anyone that might be a teacher at a local college or university? They might be a 1099. So you basically create your own entity. So startup, standalone, business in a box, 1099. So those are the various levels that will support like how you can become an entrepreneur. So the key question is that you might be wondering, which is the best option and which is the appropriate one for you? And that's a good question, which is why we're going to be talking a little bit more about the intangibles, how you can begin to discern which road might be the appropriate one for you. So part of it is your professional pedigree. So an intangible piece is, remember we're talking about people that are over 40 are usually more successful than those that are in their 20s. And part of it is because they have a certain professional pedigree that they've developed over time. They've developed certain skills or expertise over time. And as a result, they will pivot into something more independent. So that's why you'll see another data point from Gallup, which basically supports the fact that business owners saying prior experience, encouragement were key resources for them starting the business. And you'll start to see where that data is supported by. What were those resources supported by? And you'll start to see prior work experience and encouragement from people they knew were the two top things that people use as their resources to basically create their entity. And you'll start to see it go beyond the personal savings. It starts to really get further and further lower, less important as a resource. And again, same study from Shopify and Gallup. The other part that really is another benefit in the intangibles is the benefit of time. So your experience, your pedigree, the time that you have learned certain skills or capabilities, you should never underestimate that. So the benefit of time is going to be your friend. The other part, as supported by that survey that Gallup and Spotify did, that study, is don't underestimate the power of your network. And we'll talk about the power of your network because that can be a really good launching point for you if you decide you want to do something more independent than a W-2. So your network is going to become really important. And the other part is your wiring. Remember I was talking about, how we're wired earlier based on Gallup's research, which is 1 in 5 out of 100 people have what it takes to start a worldwide organization. or 5 out of 1,000. And so a lot of it is your wiring. So being self-aware is really important. So knowing what gives you energy, knowing what your natural tendencies are, knowing what you really don't do well. So knowing what you do really well and also knowing what you don't do really well is also really important in your self-awareness. So there's ways that you can understand your behavioral style. And we have 6 specific items. So DISC is a way that basically measures how you communicate. 4 insight colors also indicates what gives you energy and how you come across to others. Myers-Briggs really goes into your personality aspects and what are those attributes of certain personality traits. Myers-Briggs. StrengthsFinder. You heard earlier from Iram that I am a certified coach with the Gallup, and our basic belief is, as I said, we're all gifts. Just figure out where your talents are and lean in on those. Speaking of Gallup, they have an assessment that is called Builder Profile 10. Builder Profile 10. That will measure, or at least give you an indicator about what are your builder tendencies or competencies that you seem to have a higher predisposition towards. Remember, we're talking about those attributes. I'm going to be sharing those momentarily. The other is even more simple is like, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And then on the outside, what are your opportunities and threats outside of you? So what's the market? What are the threats outside? But more importantly, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Being able to identify those are going to be important. If anyone has another another assessment or tool that they have found useful, put that into chat as the catch-all to other. So let's continue. So the attributes, drum roll, please.
Mark, we have a couple of questions.
So that's good. Let's stop. So let me pause here. What is the question?
Okay, so the first one says, I've heard that things like Myers-Briggs is not really a scientific method. Issues with it are there any of these you think are best type of assessments?
Well, thank you for bringing up the first point, which is the thing about assessments. My basic philosophy is assessments are not 100% accurate, regardless of how well grounded the assessment might be in research and how reliable it is and how much data they have to support the different parts it's measuring. But they're not 100% accurate. They're just good indicators. So Myers-Briggs is an input. So there are a lot of people that say Myers-Briggs is really awesome. I view Myers-Briggs as another input. So if you've done DISC, if you've done the 4 colors, if you've done Myers-Briggs, if you've done StrengthsFinder, that's really good. In the second part of the question, which is there something that might be really helpful for you as you're trying to figure out this entrepreneur thing? Builder Profile 10 is trying to measure your attributes and how much of those attributes are more dominant than others. And that speaks more towards the entrepreneurial attributes. Okay. Does that answer the question? And if it doesn't, come back to chat and we'll make me honest.
And the next question actually goes right into it. Does Builder 10 cost anything?
Builder 10 does. But if I should have checked before. The last I checked, it was under $30. So it's not like this $150 assessment. And the great thing about Gallup, if you've done any of their assessments, is and somebody might go to the Google machine and check to see, keep me honest, is how much it is now.
Maureen said it's 20.
All right, there we go. Thank you, Mo. Excellent. So yeah, okay, so it's $20 still. All right, great. And for $20, you'll have an input.
And then Sheila responded, yes, thanks. Last one. I did some of these over 10 years ago. Do you see people's attributes change over time?
They might shift slightly. For example, I mentioned StrengthsFinder earlier. It's like what you'll find is if an assessment is highly reliable, what you'll find over time is what it's measuring is it will measure. Now, as we age and as we go through our career, we might slightly deviate or slightly pivot. But what you'll find is like in your, say, for example, StrengthsFinder top 10, 7 of your top 10 will probably still be in your top 10. And 3 might go below the 10, and then 3 others might rise up. So that's part 1. So you'll see some maybe deviation. The thing that causes probably the biggest change in assessment results are traumatic experiences. Or I've had a colleague that got a severe head injury, a severe concussion, and their personality literally changed. So in those extreme opportunities, that's where you'll see probably bigger deltas between a survey, an assessment you might have done 10 years ago and now. Doesn't mean you shouldn't redo them to see how they've evolved, but chances are you'll probably find that you're kind of in that same swim lane in the swimming pool.
All right, and then the other the assessments that were posted in the chat are positiveintelligence.com and Simply5, and Simply is spelled with an I.
Okay, awesome. So again, I would imagine that Simply5 might be, is that more like a strengths assessment type? And I'll let them type that in chat. But that's great. But view all of these as inputs, right? It's just basically, if you've done assessments like these, take them out and kind of spread them out, because that will begin to create a mosaic for how you're wired and how you're predisposed.
Okay, they said it's similar to DISC.
Okay, so communication. Okay, how we communicate, etc. All right, awesome. So getting to the builder profile 10, where you'll start to see the 10 attributes that it starts to measure is business focus, confidence, delegation capability, your determination. Are you a disruptor? Are you independent? Are you a knowledge seeker? Are you a promoter? Are you more a relation builder? Are you a risk taker? And if you had to identify which of these is most important, type into chat which is probably the most important of all 10. And what's come through here?
So far we had relationship builder, and then several determination, knowledge seeker, risk taker.
Mm-hmm. And you're probably sitting, and some of you haven't responded, like, man, all of these are important. And if you're sitting there
That was
saying,
my instant, I was like, oh no.
yeah, I'm sorry, this was a trick question by yours truly. But basically, yes, this is really what I was getting at here, is like all of these attributes are really important. But here's the thing, is that you're not going to have all of these attributes as core competencies. That's why if you're considering doing a partnership with someone, you might want to find out, beyond just a best friend, you might want to find out or understand or appreciate what their natural tendencies are, because what you want to have happen is you want to be partnered with somebody who's going to offset yours or complement yours. Now, I like to say that without having Steve, there would not be an Apple computer. So if you recall, Steve Jobs got together with a buddy, Steve Wozniak. Steve was the dreamer. Woz was the technophobe. Was the geek that loved this concept of computers. Without Steve having Steve, there would not be an Apple. So it kind of supports this whole thing about competencies. If you are considering getting into a partnership with someone, knowing what your natural tendencies are going to be really important. Or if you're considering what type of business, how you might become entrepreneur. Remember I talked about business in a box? There are so many different businesses that are being templated. You might, when you're going down that road, you might really seriously find out, how will you support me? These are my strengths, but then this part, nah, not so much. So how will you support that, and will you support that? Because there are some businesses that are really good at doing really strong support. There are other businesses in a box. It's like, here you go, good luck. Let us know how we can help, and that's it. So The BP10, the building profile 10, that begins to give you an idea of how you're predisposed. So if you're at this fork in the road, you might say, okay, let me just figure out what seems to be a natural tendency for me around this entrepreneurial builder opportunity. So it gets to this whole thing about it's all about our wiring. So it really speaks to like, don't underestimate your becoming self-aware about what you'll bring to this opportunity, and just being honest with yourself is that this is how you're predisposed. I'll give you an example of how this is really important. When I would chat with people that are in a career transition or they were thinking of doing something entrepreneurial, I would ask them, one of the questions I would ask them is it, how do you like networking? And then people would say, Mark, I don't, if I have to do it, I'll do it. Or, you know what, I said, okay, fast forward 2 years from today, look at your calendar, and then you're going to see you've got 15 networking opportunities that you have on your schedule for the week. What's your reaction? And put yourself in that mode 2 years from now, that use that as an indicator, because if the business you are considering requires a lot of business development, a lot of business relationship building, networking, etc., and that is not in your wheelhouse, doesn't mean you can't do it, but you probably need to have someone who that is in their wheelhouse. So spouse, friend, colleague, business partner. Again, this speaks to your wiring. So really pay attention to your wiring and how you're showing up. And BP10 is a good indicator for that. So the other part is, since you're on this call, indicates some of you are on a career pivot. So understand that if you're in a career pivot, most people think that success will look like this nice straight line. When the reality of it is, this is what it really looks like. You're going to have ebbs and flows. It's not going to be a straight line. And then now, if you lean in on the resources, perhaps this is what it can look like, perhaps, if you take enough time to reflect and assess and perhaps set yourself up. So the key question is, so how? So it's all in the prep, I like to say. So now we're getting into the how thing. So now we'll get into this concept of resources. So here's some 20 questions from the Small Business Administration. And these are some questions that you should consider. Why am I starting a business? What kind of business do I want? Who is my ideal customer? What products, services will I offer? Am I prepared to spend the time and money needed to get started? What differentiates my business from others in the same market? Where will all the businesses be located? Again, if it's a brick and mortar, or even if it's virtual, like Shopify, Amazon, Facebook Marketplace, Emory alumni. Where's it going to be located? How many employees will you need? What types of suppliers will you need? How much money do I need to start? Will I need a loan? How will I get it? How soon before I have products or services available to deliver? How long until I start to make a profit? Remember the rule of 3. Who is my competition? You did that SWOT analysis, taking an external focus. How to price for, how price versus competition. Where does that fall? Again, could go into your research. What legal structure for my business? You can go to some online resources, but you might, if you have an accountant, you can explain to them what you're considering doing, and they may give you an idea about what your legal structure might be. LLC, could it be an S Corp? Could it be a C Corp? I mean, could it be a 501c3? So it could be nonprofit. What taxes will you need to pay? That's an important consideration. What insurance will you need? How will I manage the business? How will I advertise and promote my business? So these are all example 20 questions to begin to reflect on. If you want to do print screen on this, and you can go through the questions at a later time. So back to the resources now. So we will provide you links to all of these links that I will be sharing momentarily. So let's go to the resources. First one foremost, hey, since we're on Emory's dime here, the Emory Coaching Network is going to be an important one. There's chock full of coaches that are willing to help you kind of navigate that. One of those coaches is actually on this call today. So lean in on Maureen. Right, Maureen? Lean in on Maureen as an example coach. There's a book by Michael Gerber called E-Myth Revisited. For those entrepreneurs, that's a great read because it kind of gives you some sage things to consider if you're considering becoming an entrepreneur. A business plan. So Forbes magazine actually has a template that you can go, it's a free template to creating a business plan. And we'll share the link with you momentarily. Then I share your network. So who do you connected with? And notice number 5 is family. So family is number 5. And then friends are number 6. You might say, Mark, why didn't you put family and friends as 1 and 2? The reason is because the prospect of you doing something independent might be tempered by family and friends. So in other words, you might have an aspiration. They'll say, oh, you don't want to do that. Or, oh, really? And then they'll start to put questions in your head because they'll thrust their fears and concerns onto you. So obviously your family and friends are going to be important, but be aware that don't put them as your top resources to help justify this business endeavor. Small Business Administration, SBA, a government agency providing great resources. And speaking of resources, there's a group called the Small Business Development Center. We have a number of resources in Georgia and then in California, for those in California, that are basically, it's called Small Business Development Center. It's chock full of resources to help you kind of begin to formalize your business plan, come up with a marketing plan, etc. And there's a group of retired executives called SCORE, which will provide for pro bono consulting or mentoring opportunities to help you kind of navigate in your business. Now, for funding, don't think you need to use just your personal savings or family and friends, but you might be able to leverage your 401k, not to say 100%, but there's a group called Guidant Financial as one example. They will help you finance your business using some of your 401k, not all of it, but some of it. So those are some of the key resources. Now, I mentioned Gallup, and this will be the last reference to this survey or study that Gallup did, which is all about when they were talking about aspiring entrepreneurs, top available resources for starting a business. And you'll start to see the top 2, encouragement from people you know and prior work, if you recall. Those are the top 2. And the other was personal savings. And then it really started to taper off. So don't forget that resource as well. Okay. So I'm sensitive to our time. So I'm going to pause here and we'll open it up to Q&A. And while that's up here, I will just put in my LinkedIn QR code. And then you'll say, oh, that's Mark's cover for his book that he wrote way back when. So you can reference that. So let me just pause here and say, okay, Irma, I am done. Let's see what else has come through in the questions.
Someone just, I guess they missed when you went over the rule of 3. If you could briefly repeat that.
Yes. 3 times harder, 3 times longer, and 3 times more expensive than you thought. So if you have that as a filter saying, all right, I'm thinking about doing this business, and you have 3 times longer, 3 times harder, 3 times more expensive, you're like, I'm cool with that. It's like, good. All right. As long as you put it to that filter, you'll be okay.
And Maureen added a comment to the chat saying family and friends can't help you be objective to make this type of decision.
There you go, Mo. Exactly, Maureen, because they're not subjective. Exactly. And great having you on this webinar today, Maureen, by the way.
Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat.
So as you consider this, the fact that you're on this call tells us that, you're gathering context, you're trying to figure stuff out. But just keep in the back of your mind as I close is like, this is always an option, and it doesn't have to be something that's a worldwide entity. It could be something very simple, right? And that's why when you get beyond your fourth quarter, you might have people. I'm one. I don't know about Maureen, but my approach is going to be to keep doing this until whenever, right? Because I can keep doing this until whenever, and have a lot of fulfillment. So I wish everything you wish for yourselves on this quest, and I'll stay online here with Iram and everyone else. Thank you so much for attending today.
Thank you, guys. All right. So as Mark mentioned, you will be getting a follow-up email from me. Thank you guys so much for being here. Please help me give Mark a huge thank you for sharing his expertise with us. Lots of great information, lots of great resources. As I mentioned, you will receive an email with the survey link for today's webinar. Please do complete that. And if you want to do it like non-anonymously, of course you can, but if you want to share your information with us, you might be included in a drawing for a swag prize pack. So we do encourage you guys to do those surveys. We read them, we share your feedback with the coaches to make these programs better. So on behalf of the Emory Alumni Association, we want to thank you again for learning with us and have a great day.